Welcome to CivilNet. My name is Maral Tavitian, and I'm here with my guest, Professor Richard Finnegan. He's a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being with us today.
No, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
So you are an expert on Irish politics and Ireland, and I want to start off by talking about some parallels between the Irish and Armenian diasporas in the US. So how large and diverse is the Irish diaspora in the United States?
Well, that's a contested question in this way. There's a diaspora from Ireland that occurs in the 1700s and 1800s that's a movement from Scotland through Northern Ireland to the southern part of the United States. Then another diaspora, which is much, much bigger, after the Irish famine, 1846, 1850, that set off a chain of movement to the United States that was very, very large and lasted well into the 1920s. They felt exiled. They were poor, predominantly from the west of Ireland, and when they came to the United States, they had nothing. They had to scrape by, and they were discriminated against. But the old Irish need not apply to certain kinds of jobs, and often women got jobs because they could work as housekeepers, but men could not unless they got jobs in construction and things like that. So that is what sets the scene, and the Irish Americans have this those Irish Americans had a frozen memory of British oppression and British indifference to the famine. And then the people who immigrate in the 20s are losers in a civil war. So their memories are filled with anger also against the British.
Right.
So then when Ireland becomes autonomous in 1922, the Americans kind of cease to pay attention. And this is long before social media or flights and so on. So there's a real disconnection between them and the homeland. That persists until the Northern Ireland Troubles break out, 1968. At that point, there was in the interest of some Irish in Ireland to mobilize Irish America. So the first mobilization of Irish America occurs after 1968, and it's very pro-IRA and pro-nationalist and anti-British. It takes about till the mid-1980s, and when Irish politicians and diplomats begin to essentially educate Irish American groups and organizations to what the fundamental arrangements were in Northern Ireland. A former Prime Minister named Garrett Fitzgerald said he'd come over to tell Americans to stop helping Irish people kill other Irish people. And at that point, Irish American elites mobilize and create organizations which are like the Ireland Fund is the most well known, which produce enormous amounts of money in the millions, and their motto was peace, culture, and charity.
Right.
And so they put the money into those kinds of organizations. And that made the Irish American diaspora look more like, also they had made it now, so they had money, look like the Armenian diaspora.
Right.
The issue of numbers has always been brewed about. There are people who like to think there's 48 million Irish Americans of Irish heritage. Are we counting that first 17th century wave? Or who are we counting? Most serious scholars put it at about 4 times or 5 times the population. Now the population now is 4.5 million or more, but then it wasn't, it was smaller. Ireland had been drained by immigration. So a figure of 20 or more would be pretty accurate. Yeah.
And here in Armenia, we talk a lot about diaspora involvement in the political, economic, social development of the Republic of Armenia. How involved, if at all, are Irish Americans in Irish politics?
Not so much. The Irish political parties and Irish politicians, actually the energy moved in the other direction. That is, they wanted to mobilize Irish Americans, they wanted to fundraise in the United States. And the ordinary Irish American, not in Chicago, Boston, New York, but that was not very much in their consciousness at all. In those cities, they had two factors that worked. One was Irish America had made it, so there was money to be tapped and consciousness to be raised. And so the focus was to mobilize them. Then there's much more generosity. That's when the generosity starts to emerge from the 80s on, and still does.
I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the Northern Ireland peace process. And how instructive do you think the Northern Ireland peace process is to some of the current and unresolved conflicts around the world? And maybe you could talk a little bit about its application to the ongoing conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Well, I could do that in several ways. But first, how did the Irish peace process come about to bring the 1998 agreement? And there were four conditions. First of all, you had to overcome the absolute resistance of Ulster Unionists who did not want any change in the status of Northern Ireland. And they were powerful in that they could either use direct resistance, like demonstrations and violence, or they had seats in the British Parliament which they could use as a wedge, much as has occurred right now, where the DUP party, in a sense, has May over a barrel, as she cannot maintain a majority without them.
Right.
So they were embedded in resistance, and that intransigence favored the most extreme end. So there was a pressure on the part of Unionists always to out-Unionist any group. So moderates, you got no traction. Extremists had all the traction. So the dog of Ulster Unionism, the tail of Ulster Unionism wagged the dog of London. So that was one you had to overcome. And it was overcome when the Irish government and the British government signed an agreement over the heads of the Ulster Unionists, a direct government-to-government treaty, which said Ireland would have the Republic of Ireland, a consultative role in Northern Ireland. And what had happened was the Unionists finally learned that intransigence, and they were furious, intransigence would not win the day every time.
Right.
That's one. Two was how do you eliminate IRA violence? And a couple of things happened. 9/11. Now all of a sudden, George W. Bush said, you're with us or against us, and terrorists are not the people we want to hang around with, and the kind of loose tolerance, if you will, of the IRA was not going to happen anymore. Secondly, so much time had gone by and violence had been repeated and repeated and repeated, but no one had changed their minds. London didn't, Dublin didn't, the Unionists didn't. So Gerry Adams came to realize you could always do one more violent thing, but it wasn't going to change the fundamental alignments. And he was talked, John Hume, head of a nonviolent party, talked him into saying, you're going to have to find some other road here. And the response of the public was, more violence? This is looking just now like murder rather than some political struggle. And the third was Dublin and London. It took a while, from '68, but Dublin and London, by the mid-'80s, were on the same page. They were operating in concert. So now you had the two capitals. And this put pressure both on the Republicans and on the Unionists. Finally, U.S. involvement. Bill Clinton is not only willing to engage in the Northern Ireland problem, which other presidents weren't, but appointed George Mitchell to be the negotiator between the parties. And he was called, the night before that agreement was signed, he was calling the leader of every one of the groups in Northern Ireland, personally calling them up. That's pretty direct involvement from the President of the United States.
Right. And could you apply any of those takeaways from the peace process to the ongoing conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh?
The first thing you'd have to identify is what constitutes the Unionists. That is, what group has a vested interest in nothing changing. As the Unionists wanted nothing to change. Who are those groups? And then what kind of power, veto power, do they have only over any forward movement? Okay? And then the second is, who's the equivalent of the IRA? That is, who is willing to perpetuate a violent response? That you can shoot your way and bomb your way out of this conflict between the countries. And the third would be, if Dublin and London are cooperating, is Yerevan and Baku, thank you. Are they cooperating? Do they come to see that in a bigger picture that they have converging interests? And then finally, you have a kind of opposite problem. Only the United States was involved in was willing to get its nose into the Northern Ireland crisis. No one else did. But here you have Russia, France, and the United States.
Exactly.
And great powers are looking at that situation, calculating their interests. Not the United States. I think it doesn't have very much direct interest. Russia does. And so those are the four conditions, and how do they map onto Nagorno-Karabakh, and there are some very difficult issues on the ground here.
Right. And there are obviously a lot of lingering tensions and animosities between the populations of the two states involved in this conflict. How important is it to change the minds of regular people before reaching a peace process between two countries?
It was very important. When we always talk high politics, or first level diplomacy. What did this government say? What did that government say? And statements and agreements and all that sort of thing. But there was a dense network of civil society groups and peace building groups that had built up in the North and between the North and South and between the U.S. Irish Americans and the North. Now, they didn't get headlines, but there was a lot of that, a lot more than one would see if you just looked at the surface. So it was important. Secondly, if you went to 30,000 feet and looked down at Northern Ireland, you'd be wondering, why do these people have any issues at all? They eat the same, they look the same, they dress the same, they talk the same. So there was, and both were children of British democracy and British free press and British, we'd call pluralism, but the tolerance for civil society, lots of different groups in the society, lots of different points of view and organizations. And so that was true in the North and in the Republic. So there are these ground floor foundations that were there that helped a lot. I'll go on one point. When the IRA declared a ceasefire in '94, there was an explosion of happiness in Northern Ireland, which meant the public had, even in the Republican communities as well, the public had lost its tolerance for martial law and British armored vehicles in the streets. They were tired of it. And you have to be very careful when
Yeah.
the public gets tired of something.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Finnegan. It's really been a fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
And thank you for watching CivilNet.